The Barents Sea is a place where geography and cruelty intersect. In the summer of 1942, the sun never sets over these frigid waters, casting an eternal ghostly light upon a theater of war that offered no place to hide. This was the setting for the Arctic convoys, a lifeline of steel and explosives stretched thin across the top of the world. To the sailors who manned the merchant ships, it was known quite simply as the suicide run. The geopolitical stakes were absolute. The Soviet Union was bleeding out on the Eastern Front, and Joseph Stalin's demands for supplies were becoming increasingly shrill, bordering on accusations of betrayal. The British Admiralty was trapped between a strategic rock and a hard place. They knew the risks of the Arctic route were mathematically catastrophic. Yet the political necessity of keeping the Soviet Union in the war overrode every instinct of naval caution. This tension created a fragile bridge of ships, one that was about to be tested by a combination of German military might and a devastating failure of British high command. The story of Convoy PQ-17 is not just a chronicle of ships lost at sea. It is a study in how a single, panicked decision made in a room thousands of miles away can lead to the systematic slaughter of brave men. By late June 1942, the German Kriegsmarine had transformed Norway into a fortress of observation and interception. They had realized that the Arctic convoys were the Achilles heel of the Allied logistical effort. Under the watchful eye of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the Germans prepared Operation Rosselsprung, or Knight's Move. The centerpiece of this plan was the battleship Tirpitz, a massive modern leviathan that haunted the dreams of the British Admiralty. The Tirpitz did not even need to fire its guns to be effective. Its mere presence in a Norwegian fjord acted as a fleet in being, forcing the Royal Navy to keep its heaviest assets locked in a perpetual state of readiness. The convoy itself was a massive undertaking. 35 merchant ships laden with nearly 300 aircraft, 600 tanks, and thousands of vehicles departed from Iceland on June 27th. The cargo was enough to equip an entire army, a prize that the German high command could not ignore. Protecting this vulnerable flock was a complex layered defense. There was the close escort of destroyers and smaller corvettes, a covering force of cruisers, and a distant heavy covering force centered around the battleship HMS Duke of York and the carrier Chiommal MS Victorious. On paper, it was one of the most heavily protected convoys in history. But the Arctic is an environment that mocks paper plans. As the convoy moved north, the ice pack forced the ships into a narrow corridor, squeezing them closer to the German airfields in occupied Norway. The eternal daylight meant that German reconnaissance planes could track the convoy's every move with impunity. The psychological pressure on the merchant sailors began to mount before the first shot was even fired. They were sailing through a landscape of shifting ice and freezing mist, knowing that beneath the waves, U-boat wolf packs were already positioning themselves for the kill. The first systemic failure occurred not at sea, but in the halls of the Admiralty in London. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, was a man of immense experience, but failing health. Suffering from an undiagnosed brain tumor, Pound had become increasingly prone to micromanagement and bouts of rigid, narrow-minded thinking. He was obsessed with the Tirpitz. He feared that if the German battleship caught the convoy's cruiser cover, it would result in a naval massacre. This fear created a cognitive bias that would eventually blind him to the reality of the situation on the water. As PQ-17 rounded the North Cape, the German Luftwaffe began its assault. Heinkel torpedo bombers and Junkers dive bombers swarmed the convoy, testing the defenses. The escorting destroyers and the merchant ships' own gunners put up a fierce resistance. Despite the intensity of the attacks, the losses were initially manageable. The system was holding. The cruisers, led by Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton, were positioned to provide support against surface threats. The plan was working, but the shadow of the Tirpitz loomed larger than the actual planes in the sky. Intelligence reports from Bletchley Park were inconclusive. They knew the Tirpitz had moved from its usual anchorage, but they did not know where it was. This vacuum of information was filled by Pound's worst-case scenarios. He began to believe that the German heavy surface units were already closing in on the convoy. In reality, the Tirpitz was still waiting for Hitler's personal authorization to engage, a delay that the British command could not have known. The tension in the Admiralty's basement reached a breaking point on the evening of July 4th. Admiral Pound convened a meeting that would become infamous in naval history. Ignoring the advice of his intelligence officers, who pointed out there was no hard evidence the Tirpitz was at sea, Pound decided to take drastic action. He believed the only way to save the escort ships from destruction was to pull them away and let the merchant ships fend for themselves. This was a reversal of every tenet of naval escort doctrine. The merchant ships were the reason the escorts existed, yet Pound was about to sacrifice the cargo to save the hulls of the warships. 3 signals were sent in rapid succession, each one more devastating than the last. The first ordered the cruiser force to withdraw to the west at high speed. The second ordered the convoy to disperse. The third, sent at 9:36 p.m., was the death warrant. Convoy is to scatter. The word scatter had a specific, terrifying meaning in naval parlance. It meant that every ship was now on its own, responsible for its own navigation and survival in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The protective screen of destroyers, following orders from London, turned and steamed away, leaving the merchantmen alone in the silent, sunlit Arctic. The tactical disaster that followed was a direct result of this bureaucratic panic. When the merchant captains saw their protectors fleeing over the horizon, a sense of profound abandonment set in. They were slow, lumbering vessels, many of them carrying highly volatile ammunition and fuel. Without the coordinated anti-aircraft fire of the destroyers or the depth-charge screens against U-boats, they were sitting ducks. The German commanders could hardly believe their luck. They called off the surface sortie of the Tirpitz, realizing that the Luftwaffe and the U-boats could now finish the job without risking a single heavy ship. The slaughter began in earnest on July 5th. The convoy was no longer a cohesive unit, but a scattered collection of targets spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The Luftwaffe operated with the efficiency of a factory. Group after group of bombers descended upon the isolated ships. The SS Daniel Morgan, a ship that had fought valiantly, was pounded by bombers and eventually finished off by a U-boat. The SS Hanemu was sent to the bottom in minutes. The sailors who managed to get into lifeboats found themselves in a nightmare of freezing water and drifting ice, watching as their comrades were picked off one by one. The U-boats, led by aces like Reinhard Hardigan, moved in for the easy kill. They didn't even need to use their torpedoes in some cases, surfacing to use their deck guns against the defenseless merchantmen. The sea was littered with debris, oil slicks, and the haunting sights of half-submerged tanks and aircraft crates. For the men in the water, the eternal sun was a curse. There was no darkness to hide them, no night to bring a reprieve, from the constant humming of German engines overhead. The Barents Sea had become a giant open-air shooting gallery. Yet amid this systemic collapse, stories of incredible heroism emerged. These were the unsung heroes who refused to accept the death sentence passed down from London. Captain Jack Broom, who had commanded the destroyer escort, was haunted by the order to leave, but he had to follow the chain of command. However, some of the smaller escort vessels, like the minesweepers and the armed trawlers, stayed. They gathered what ships they could, forming tiny, defiant pockets of resistance. One of the most remarkable stories was that of the MS Palomares and the HLMS Poza Rica, anti-aircraft ships that tried to shepherd groups of survivors toward the Russian coast. There was also the crew of the SS Earlston and the SS Empire Byron, who fought until their guns were hot and their decks were awash. These men were not professional warriors in the traditional sense. They were merchant sailors and reservists, yet they displayed a level of grit that stood in stark contrast to the indecision of the high command. Another hero was Lieutenant Commander Richard Stannard, who led a small group of surviving ships into the relative safety of the ice pack. They painted their ships white to blend in with the ice floes, a desperate but brilliant bit of improvisation. For days, they played a lethal game of hide and seek with German reconnaissance planes, moving only when the mist provided cover. These small acts of leadership saved hundreds of lives that would otherwise have been lost to the waves. But these were small victories in a sea of tragedy. Of the 35 merchant ships that had set out with such high hopes, only 11 reached the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The losses were staggering. 24 ships sunk, 153 sailors dead, and enough equipment lost to have changed the course of several major battles on the Eastern Front. When the survivors finally limped into port, they were met not with cheers, but with the cold, suspicious stares of Soviet officials who couldn't understand why the British had abandoned them. The political fallout was immediate and poisonous. Stalin used the disaster of PQ-17 to browbeat Churchill, accusing the Royal Navy of cowardice. The relationship between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, already strained by ideological differences, was pushed to the breaking point. The British were forced to suspend the Arctic convoys for months, leaving the Red Army to face the German summer offensive of 1942, with significantly less support than promised. The shadow of PQ-17 would hang over every subsequent naval operation in the North. The final conclusion of PQ-17 is a haunting lesson in the dangers of centralized command. Admiral Pound's decision was based on a fundamental lack of trust in his commanders on the spot. He chose to manage the battle from a map room in London, ignoring the tactical reality of the Barents Sea. The irony is that the Tirpitz, the monster he so feared, never even made contact with the convoy. It was the fear of the threat, rather than the threat itself, that destroyed PQ-17. The systemic failure was one of imagination and nerve, a collapse of the very leadership structure meant to protect the men at the front. Philosophically, PQ-17 stands as a monument to the cold mathematics of total war. It reminds us that in the grand strategy of nations, individual lives are often treated as expendable currency. The tragedy was not just in the sinking of the ships, but in the unnecessary nature of the sacrifice. The men who died in the freezing waters of the Arctic were victims of a bureaucratic ghost, a phantom battleship that won its greatest victory without firing a single shell. As we look back at the dark waters of July 1942, we see a cautionary tale about the distance between those who give orders and those who must execute them. The legacy of PQ-17 is written in the rusted hulls that still sit at the bottom of the Barents Sea, a silent testament to a moment when the system failed and the individual was left to face the abyss alone. The ice has long since closed over the gaps where the ships went down, but the memory of the scattering remains a chilling reminder of the cost of fear in a time of war. The sun eventually set on the tragedy of PQ-17, but the echoes of those frantic July days still resonate through the annals of naval history. It was a disaster born of a perfect storm of intelligence failure, command paralysis, and the ruthless efficiency of an enemy that sensed weakness. The merchant sailors, the unsung laborers of the sea, paid the ultimate price for a mistake made in a quiet office in London. They were the ones who faced the freezing spray and the whistling bombs, the ones who watched their friends vanish into the gray depths. In the end, history judges not just by the victories won, but by the failures endured. PQ-17 remains one of the most painful chapters of World War II, a stark illustration of the friction of war. It teaches us that even the most powerful navies are vulnerable to the fragility of the human mind. The story of the convoy that was ordered to scatter is a story of courage in the face of abandonment, a narrative of men who were lost by their leaders but found their own measure of immortality in the coldest reaches of the world. The Barents Sea remains indifferent to the drama that unfolded upon its surface. The waves continue to crash against the jagged Norwegian coast, and the mists still roll in from the north, obscuring the horizon. But beneath that surface lies the wreckage of a billion-dollar mistake and the bones of those who had no choice but to follow orders. Theirs is a silent vigil in the deep, a reminder that in the theater of war, the most dangerous weapon is often the one that never leaves the harbor, and the most devastating blow is the one struck by a trembling hand on a telegraph key. The saga of PQ-17 is over, but its ghost remains. It serves as a permanent warning to every commander who follows that the map is not the territory, and the lives of men are a sacred trust that should never be sacrificed to the phantoms of uncertainty. The Arctic light shines on, cold and unwavering, illuminating a graveyard that should never have been, and a story that must never be forgotten. The merchantmen of the Suicide Run finally found their rest, but their tragedy remains etched in the frozen heart of the North, a cinematic testament to the high price of a single fatal error.
At word of the sword, a tumor of panic, a telegraph key, signing the death warrant out on the sea. Scatter, the order that shattered the line, leaving the sheep to the wolves by design. Scatter, the signal that killed all the brave, abandoning comrades to the Barents' cold grave. No cover, no escort, just the white out and spray. The pride of the Navy has sailed far away. The Henkels descended like vultures in flight. There is no dark, there is no cover of night. The Daniel Morgan is sinking in flame, and the ocean is screaming every mother's name. U-boats surfacing, deck guns for sport, far from the safety of any home port. The Palomares is hiding in floes made of white, a desperate gamble through the eternal light. 1,400 souls left to the deep. The price of the panic that the Admiralty will keep the ghost of a battleship won the whole day, without firing a shot, without entering the fray. Keeps what it finds, a monument built for the broken of minds. 11 reached home, 24 stayed behind, in the silence of ice, for the world to be blind. The watch is over, the convoy is gone, the Arctic light lingers on and on.